It's been a long time since I covered Marvel personally, and that's something I regret to a degree. That even though recent movies have been more mediocre, which is the case for any major cinematic universe that is persevering far more than any other franchise in history, I still enjoy it to some extent. And the most interesting area that the MCU has tried to tackle to varying degrees of success is of course their villains. Because as we all know in the world of comic books and in general superheroes, villains are a major power player with the most destructive abilities in the universe, ranging from very small to enormously big. Their characters are just probably the more fascinating things to come out of the pages. Of course, for someone like me, I don't really read comic books that often unless I'm looking at lore reasons for certain characters, and mainly just enjoy the popcorn movies of Marvel. And one of the more interesting types of villains are the ones that can hold such tremendous power and tremendous size, the type of antagonist that can annihilate worlds if they choose to do so, or just without a hero to even fully stop them. Most prominently in this case, we are talking about Ego from Guardians of the Galaxy, the celestial planet in the MCU that serves as Peter Quill's real father, who spent years looking for him. The reason why I wanted to talk about him specifically is because of a certain scene involving him and Peter in Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, and how that speaks volumes to his effectiveness as the film's villain and the ever-progressing story of the Marvel Universe. Because Guardians is just one of those franchises that works quite well for Marvel in most of their appearances, and focuses on the members as one big family, that we see a ragtag group of characters that come from broken families, either on their own, adopted, and just usually coming from tragic stories of loss. Which is how Guardians itself started off, with the story of Peter Quill losing his mom to cancer and then running off before Yondu took him for himself, or what we will know eventually just for his real father to find him, but ending up raising him over the years, training him like a Ravager, and then eventually culminating in the formation of the Guardians of the Galaxy. That the Guardians are formed not just out of a band of heroes or a group of friends helping to fight the defenseless people, but an actual family that loves and supports each other to do the right thing no matter the cost, which is very different from the story we are about to see in one of the most powerful Marvel foes that has ever been created so far. And please, for the sake of what most people have seen in storytelling, let's not get into any comic specifics to why he might be not. I don't know every Marvel villain, and this is just based upon my movie knowledge, however small that might be. Also praising the performance that Kurt Russell did for Ego, doing a great job portraying someone searching for his long lost son, but also ended up not caring about his true feelings when it comes to his end goal. Just like how I don't care how many people try so many times to say that Walt Disney's own last words before he died was in fact Kurt Russell, since he was a rising star at Disney at the time. But beyond that, in terms of speaking about Ego, is speaking of the powerful race known as the Celestials, cosmic beings who are larger than planets itself and older than the universe to the likes of their own fellow gods. Most are born out of emerging from various planets, but in terms of this villain, he gets to form itself over millions of years, solely existing as this brain to become a small, living planet, which again is debatable by many comic fans if he is a Celestial or just claims to be one with his powers, but looking at their end goals, he still aligns with their own traits of his existence. That Ego as a character was just born into this world with nothing else, trying to form his version of life that he had never seen yet and search for meaning within those definitions. So when he finally managed to learn how to manipulate the matter around him to form this planet-like structure, he created a body to explore the universe to try to find other forms of life. The good news was that he found other living creatures, but the bad news was that they were disappointing to him, as any immortal being would feel when they find an inferior mortal species. So in that regard, he set out to make the universe a bigger extension of himself, planting the seed in various female creatures to create someone similar to himself and begin the expansion as he had done as that simple brain. So his own end goals would be to become like God, trying to remake everything in his image, but in terms of the fact that it would only be him everywhere rather than other people, since he was isolated from the rest of the species who probably didn't even know him or want to talk about him, or even doubting if even he himself knew that these planets might have baby Celestials inside, because Eternals is not a good movie. Basically, what we are seeing is a selfish fool who cannot find himself existing with lower forms of life, as we'll see later on in the film. And that's where Yondu came into play when he paid him to deliver all the offspring to him to see if they have Celestial genes to help him commit to the expansion and genocide to that extent, not knowing until much later with the introduction of Quill. This speaks to the introduction of those like Meredith Quill, whom he formed a relationship with in Missouri. But unlike those other relationships, this was probably the one that he fell in love. That there came a point to realize that he could have strayed from his own destined purpose since he visited her at least 3 times. Which one was obviously responsible for the gift and creation of Peter Quill, who grew up not knowing him at all since he reluctantly planted something inside of her head. Of course, you all know what kind of thing that is later since it caused her death, but I'm saving that for a more dramatic effect, to prove how careless this being could be for those selfish reasons. That even though he had a chance to do good and come across as a well-meaning traveler, he still chose not to do that for the chance to make everything into his own. Literally. And it was all enough evil to the point that any of his offspring that did not carry a celestial gene that Yondu delivered to him would eventually be killed off. They had served no purpose to him because they are like the rest of the disappointing lifeforms across the stars. So to his disgust and guilt, he decided to keep Peter under the guise of being useful to the Ravagers with his skinny frame. For Peter's relationship growing up, it wasn't the best since he was trained this way with Kraglin and Yondu, but in the eyes of what is known, it was probably better than what he would experience when he first met his father. Someone who actually cared about who he was being with rather than him populating himself until he found the right offspring when they were ready. And he did a good job leading to the path of the formation of the Guardians, who we see here working today as a small family to the helpless. Until of course someone decides to steal their own batteries and chase them, where finally over 3 decades after his last appearance on Earth, Ego finally catches up to his own son. Hearing about his exploits with the rest of the Guardians, where he survived the power of an Infinity Stone, where only the strongest or godlike beings can only withstand such raw power, and that also his infamous name of Star-Lord that most people mocked him actually caught his attention. And going to Peter's perspective, it's very conflicting for him just for him to show up like that after he grew up with his own mother watching other kids play with their fathers, while simply believing in stories like David Hasselhoff being his father in reference to Knight Rider. Just a lot to take in, even though he was mostly taken away to be raised by Yondu, who threatened to eat him.
Eat you? Yeah, oh that son of a bitch.
Which of course over here, Ego at first expresses outrage like a real father would, but also layered in a way when you know and find out the truth that it's just frustration for not getting the actual son who probably mattered to his plan. This is also the introduction of Mantis, who served as an assistant to Ego, who later down in the series itself would find out to also be his daughter and by extent Peter's half-sister, who also has powers that allows her to be empathic and ease Ego's minds to go to sleep on occasion. He gets convinced to go along with them to this planet by Gamora because it could be the right thing to do to get to know his own father, at a time when Gamora herself was also dealing with her sister, who did service another villain in Ronan, being the adopted daughters of Thanos, and having the pain of him as a father. And when we finally arrive on the planet, we get to see something that looks quite beautiful in a paradise of his own design, since it literally is layers of himself and how it's only as big as the moon, where he finally reveals to them that he is known as a Celestial, though like similar to that of the dead head of nowhere that they established based on, amongst other things, before explaining his backstory up to this point. This is where he stresses how important it was to search for Peter, knowing he was human who survived the force of the Infinity Stone, something that only the woman he truly loved the most could have produced. Again, only knowing at this point in the story that he is a simple Celestial who built this planet and traversed the cosmos to find sources of life. The only life seen is what was produced on Earth so far, rather than the hidden truth of Peter and Mantis' dead brothers and sisters. Most of his scenes in the first half of the film is to try to reconnect and attempt to bond with Peter, to try to give him the thing he's been searching for, like playing ball. Yet Peter still expresses his frustrations to him because his mother was left here on this planet to die in front of him, while Ego was out there on his planet trying to sustain himself or whatever, leaving him also up to the devices of Yondu, a Ravager criminal raising him.
If I don't return regularly to my planet and the light within it, this form will wither and perish.
So why didn't you come back? Why did you send Yondu, a criminal of all people, to come and to fetch you?
I loved your mother, Peter. I couldn't stand to set foot on an Earth where she wasn't living. You can't imagine what that's like.
I know exactly what that feels like. I had to watch her die!
A very understandable perspective when his own nature is beyond any mortal being who can succumb to the worst diseases like cancer, which he also comes to understand this failure, pleading to him that he wants to be the father that she would want him to be, the spaceman that she loved. But how this might not be true in the case because of the secret knowledge of every other son or daughter that has been killed when it comes to this next test under the guise of looking like a father and son playing ball that he wanted.
Yes! Yes! Whoa!
that he's finally elated to discover that he does in fact have the powers when he screamed yes, but this is for the real fact that he can use him to recreate the universe rather than appearing to be building his relationship with his son that has the same gene he has. I mean, it could be debatable by the conversation that they started when Peter raged about his mom and he apologized wanting to make up for those mistakes, but the end goal still remains to be the same in his mind, and it's not for a positive reason. Well, maybe not positive for all of us instead of him. And there's nothing more effective than a villain who's related to the hero in some form and trying to appear to be a positive influence when the world around him seems to be secretly not. Like Gamora questioning Mantis after almost telling Drax the truth after feeling what happened in his life. That although things might look okay on the surface of Ego, both in the humanoid figure and the planet itself, nothing but Mantis or him actually exists around him. She changes her opinion around Quill after their initial burst of romantic feelings about the state of Ego, that nothing about the Celestial seems right because of the Guardians themselves already act as a family, thinking he'd already found it in them, rather than this awkward reunion finding his real father who exists within himself. And going back to him that very night, he discusses one of the songs played on his Walkman, Looking Glass's Brandy, You're a Fine Girl, that played at the very beginning of the film, calling it one of Earth's greatest compositions as his mother sang it as related to his own task. Ego uses the song as a call to action for himself, when the sailor in the song calls Brandy a fine girl who would make a good wife, but his life, his love, and his lady is the sea. Just like Ego's own natural calling to the expansion, the cosmos itself is his calling rather than Meredith, whom he loved.
Only we can remake the universe. Only we can take the bridle of the cosmos and lead it to where it needs to go.
That we cannot indulge ourselves in what mortals love the most or live with, as our destiny of godlike creatures calls for greater purposes. That the truth, as long as Ego lives, Peter will also have such abilities that can last him beyond the centuries or millennia to come as an immortal. That although we might love someone, you understand that they will never be with you forever, and that's not worth living for. Trying to slowly and steadily convince them that this is where destiny guides them. All the great men of history are built on purpose, actually manipulating him to believe that everything you know in life is disappointing and inferior to the truth of eternity. Maybe not that eternity, but the other one, of course. His character in reality is more selfish than we thought, considering the fact that he planted seeds throughout millions of worlds and impregnated millions of species so that one may return to fully enact his plot to turn their surfaces into extensions of his own self. That mortal life should slowly be replaced by celestial ones that exist far beyond most and are always, if properly done unlike Ego, born out of planets by destroying it. That the meaning of life should be derived by completely removing the ones who are temporary in the universe and fully replacing it by the one who are permanent. And that's almost enough to convince him by the sheer beauty portrayed in his eyes of this concept, yet stopped by looking back on his own mortal identity because of his friends, who also are now trying their best to save them after understanding the dead bones and the claiming that they are really a family, just as Yondu returned with Rocket. Because the thing that stops him from fully committing to Ego's plan without a single thought comes from the most famous scene that I really based this whole video on, with the reason that people come into existence with their own mother, explaining that he really did love his mother, almost to the point he could have settled down with her if he visited a fourth time to Earth, probably becoming a real father to Peter, until he said this very truth.
It broke my heart to put that tumor in her head. What?
This remains to be one of the most iconic MCU scenes when you realize that his own mother's death, her pain and suffering with the cancerous brain tumors were the result of Ego's own doing. Although he expressed regret, saying it broke his heart since he still did love her, he still did it regardless so he can move on with his ultimate goal, which breaks Peter into a rage trying to shoot his body into oblivion. That we also remind you that he early expressed same rage about watching his own mother die in front of him on that bed, who always thought positively about Ego despite his own nature, where his name really fits who he is as a person when we simply regard our own egos at times when we tend to favor ourselves. And he did that in this instance because he valued his own immortal life over her mortals and everyone else's. And even though some might say that she could have died regardless over the years because she is mortal and things of like old age, he'd still feel guilty leaving her like that, so he had no choice in his mind but to, well, kill her in this way. But in retaliation, Ego, thinking his son is being a disobedient little rascal, attempts to punish him in a way that any father would, by turning them into a battery to fuel the expansion.
Who in the hell do you think you are? are!
That we see his true character, who couldn't care less of the real concerns of hurting his own son by killing his lover, even though he felt shame for doing so because he could care less about the concerns of petty short forms of life. Or worst above all, crushing Peter's Walkman to symbolize this new direction he wanted, like grounding a bad child for misbehaving that breaks his own heart, and quite possibly the rest of the film's soundtrack. I mean, not really. But fortunately, this was managed to be temporarily halted by the actions of Yondu crashing into Ego himself.
Hey there, jackass!
This is where we start to talk more about Yondu's own role in the film and in Peter's life, believing he was harsh on him at first, but now opening his heart to those like Rocket, revealing a darker past where his own parents sold him into slavery before he was freed by the Ravagers. But even then, he also regretted betraying the code when Ego also offered him compensation for trafficking these children until he learned of the sad truth of the fate of the others, rescuing and raising Quill as a result. And just saying he was funny when he said he was going to eat him, among other things that prove a character with actual heart for people he loves, despite a colder, brutal exterior. That sometimes what we truly wish for is not what we want to actually get, and what we have turns out to be better. And after Mantis tries to hold off Ego by inducing sleep while they destroy the Sovereign drones, she unfortunately gets hit and revives Ego, who manages to find them all and trap them, reconstructing his body and continuing with the expansion at the cost of Peter's own life. But the thing that saves him is in fact his family, with Yondu's own words about how he doesn't control his arrow through his head but his heart, which unfortunately got cut off at the end there, but it's still present when the message is clear that everyone except Ego was actually there for him, that he only came into the picture when he heard about a boy who survived the impossible, only played ball when it was shaping the powers that he wanted, and only wanted Peter when he could be used as a battery. So in turn, Peter's fuel turns out to be everyone from his mom up to the Guardians to fight back with his powers against Ego and virtually free everyone else, as time continues to run out when Groot presses the button to destroy the brain, while Yondu decides to stay back and rescue Quill since he's down there, sending everyone up but only with one jetpack and flight suit to survive. But for his character, he knows what exactly he needs to do when he claims he hasn't done anything right in his own life with his past regrets, but knows he can change for good for the ones he loves the most in regards to Peter, officially becoming a member of the Guardians, because on the other side in this instance, Ego's own world finally crumbles down before making one final plea.
If you kill me, you'll be just like everybody else.
What's so wrong with that?
No!
That in the end, he's truly helpless and mortal as it turns out, because he never cared about anyone, no matter how much he claimed to love Meredith or his father-son bonding attempts in this film. If he did, then he never would have put the tumor in her head and stayed on Earth to raise him, but that never was the case, when everyone else in the universe managed to pick up the slack. But the more important thing to learn about at his death is how Yondu was the real father of Peter, as he said himself.
He may have been your father, boy, but he wasn't your daddy.
It is a difference between those who raised you and those who helped birth you, when others simply do not care, and despite their own difficulties, Peter feels the exact same way when he screams in sadness as Yondu dies due to the cold vacuum of space.
I'm sorry I didn't do none of it right. I'm damn lucky you, my boy.
Which is great and symbolic for the fact that both characters met their demise, one perceived antagonist character and one perceived supporting character, switch into their own true roles in life. One may appear to be nice on the surface, but their goals are ultimately harmful, while the other one certainly trained you harsh, but loved you with all their might. It's all based upon the perspective of the person for you to determine if they fit your life or not, since they want to end it. Ego was basically a careless individual who couldn't care less if the universe was filled with anybody but himself, even if that definition included other Celestials of his own kind to that extent. His legacy as a Marvel villain is quite short to the extent of others we know nowadays, but his impact on the main characters have been felt for years, later with the evident outcomes and shaping the new heroes to build themselves on where they come from tragic parentless backgrounds on occasion, to be better than what was and fighting for a better future for all. And I'm all done now. Goodbye.